Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio. And now, here's our host, Dr. Vanessa Anceloni.
Welcome, dear listener, to Kardec Radio. We are here in the Chantilly studios at Kardec Radio to talk to you about the most important and actually urgent matter, suicide. Suicide of celebrities in the news that, in unexpected ways actually, push other people to commit suicide. And friends of ours, family members, who doesn't know anyone who has actually either attempted suicide or actually committed suicide? It's sad. The consequences are devastating for the family, for society as a whole, but mostly for the very soul. What happens? Does life really end when suicide happens? What happens in the afterlife? Can we tell more from the accounts of those who came back from their suicide attempts, like near-death experiences? Is it any different to go through a near-death experience after a suicide attempt, or is it the same as, if you had a heart attack? Well, Dr. Moody Jr. is here with us to tell us about this. He is an expert in the field of near-death experiences and the healthcare field as well, mental health. He has a lot to teach us. And you can go to his website, lifeafterlife.com, and click on a beautiful series of videos that he has been releasing, especially one on mental health and suicide. Video that can be very informative, educational, inspirational, produced by the renowned David Henshaw. And Dr. Moody Jr. is here with us, and we are delighted and honored for his presence. And we also would like to extend our gratitude for this opportunity for Dr. Moody Jr.'s wife, Cheryl, who is always very kind to us, replying to our messages and scheduling Dr. Moody's interview with us at Kardec Radio. Dear listener, when we talk about suicide, we have a true account about at Kardec's time. Actually, one day, Allan Kardec received a package at his door. When he opened it, it was a book, the Spirit's book. When he turned the first page, there was a message saying that that book saved the life of the very person who was about to commit suicide and found the book that somebody left at the bridge Point Neuf in Paris, France, at Kardec's time. And when the person was about to jump from the bridge, the person felt the book, touched the book, and when it opened, it talked about the afterlife. Of course, the person was also inspired by the higher forces, and this actually promoted an opportunity to rethink about what the person was about to do. So the teachings about the afterlife, the thinking, the raising of awareness about the continuity of life can certainly be preventative. But are there other ways and means to prevent it? I think Dr. Moody Jr. has a lot to teach us in that regard as well, because depression can be the leading cause of suicide. And as we know, the World Health Organization tells us that by the year 2030, depression is going to be the second leading cause of diseases. So there's a lot for us also to understand the issues regarding mental health and how it can also lead someone to commit suicide. Dear listener, if you're listening to this live, you can talk to Dr. Moody Jr. by calling in at 858-769-4705, or you can also email to us at kardecradio@gmail.com, or you can go to the Blog Talk Radio chat room of Kardec Radio and talk to us live. If you're listening to this on demand, because all of our programs since day one in 2011, we have all the programs at Kardec Radio on demand at iTunes. We have a channel there, Kardec Radio channel, and you can also find us at Tuning Radio, which is an application that you can have in any smartphone nowadays. And you can also find us, all the programs, at kardecradio.com or blogtalkradio.com. We have many venues for you to keep in touch with us and to listen again and again, the very programs or the new ones on demand at your own leisure, no matter where you are in the world. We know we have listeners in more than 61 countries, and we want to listen from you. All of you who send us messages, please keep us informed about your suggestions, comments, questions. We'll always be happy to reply to you. Right now, we'd like to kickstart the program by telling you that in these very books of Allan Kardec, you can find solutions about suicide in the Gospel According to Spiritism, which is a book published 150 years ago by Allan Kardec in 1864. Allan Kardec talks about suicide and tells us that we need to prevent it by keeping calm and resignation before life, surrendering before life's turmoil. What is it exactly? We're going to talk about this and much more here. Let us learn more with Dr. Moody Jr. after the very break.
We will return to our program after these messages.
Getting to the Light. Spiritist Therapy for Discarnate Spirits is a small book that offers guidance to Spiritist practitioners and Spiritist counselors. Purchase your copy at www.ssbaltimore.org.
Nourish your soul with Kardec Radio.
If you missed out on any previous shows, no worries. We have an on-demand section of all previous shows and interviews. Go to our website at www.kardecradio.com.
Spread the word. Kardec Radio, to learn more about Spiritism.
Help prevent suicide by reading and sharing these books with others. 2 great books are available to help in this Kardec Radio campaign to prevent suicide. Suicide, All You Need to Know, by the international Spiritist speaker Richard Simonetti. You can buy your copy at www.roundtablepublishing-uk.com. Also, Memoirs of a Suicide by the medium Yvonne Pereda. Buy your copy today at www.ediceiofamerica.com.
Kardec Radio, live every Saturday at 11 a.m.
Kardec Radio now offers more programs during the week and weekends. Every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, you can follow the beautiful program God at Home with Francisca Kranz and the British Spiritist community. They will brighten your days by doing a God at Home meeting wherever you are in the world, while teaching you how to do the same in your own home with your family and friends. Every Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, you will hear incredibly inspirational Spiritist talks directly broadcasted by Spiritist Network. There will be true educational moments to carry out to immortality. Every Saturday, live interviews, Bridging Health and Spiritism with the host Dr. Vanessa Anceloni. You may ask questions to the interviewed guests by calling 858-769-4705. And every Sunday, tune in to Spiritist Awareness at Kardec Radio. You will hear a series of segments on a diversity of Spiritist topics. Kardec will broadcast the Spiritist Moment with Kirsten DeMello, the reading of the Spiritist book by John DeRosa and Steve Shepard, Spiritism in Your Life with Doctors Marco and Joyce Magalhães, Spiritism and the Gospel with Luiz Sérgio Marotta, Spiritist Education for Youth and Children with Bernadette Leal, Spiritist Music with James Marotta, Neuroscience and Spiritism with Dr. Vanessa Anceloni, and many more segments coming soon. Enjoy it all and nourish your soul with Kardec Radio.
And now we return to our program.
Dear listener, we are delighted to be here today live talking to the renowned Dr. Raymond Moody Jr. He is here with us to talk mostly about mental health and suicide. And you know, Dr. Moody Jr. has written more than 12 books and sold more than 13 million copies over the world. From the book Life After Life, Reunions. He's an award-winning author. He's also a world-renowned scholar, researcher. He's a physician, a PhD. He has a master's degree in philosophy. He has a bachelor's degree, honors in philosophy as well. He's a wonderful lecturer who actually was with Divaldo Franco in 2006 in Baltimore, Maryland, which was a beautiful opportunity to talk about the continuity of life. He's a private counselor. He's a featured expert in the media. He's a trainer, instructor. He also gives personal consultations. You can read more about Dr. Moody Jr. in his website, lifeafterlife.com, and also get to know about something quite interesting, his courses online. That's how we say it. He has videos nowadays that can teach us lots of things. One of them is the most recent one regarding suicide and mental health. Thank you so much, Dr. Moody Jr., for your time and for being with us today at Kardec Radio.
Well, it's always good to be with you, and so thank you so much for the invitation.
Dr. Moody, I know it's wonderful to be with you, but the topics we're going to discuss are quite, sensitive. We're going to talk about suicide. We're going to talk about mental health. What is happening around the world today that we have people committing or attempting suicide every 4 seconds? What is happening to the world? What do you think?
Well, thank you. And first of all, I think I need to sort of preface this by saying, talking a little bit about the perspective I take on this. And I am a medical doctor and psychiatrist, and before I went into medicine, I was a philosophy professor. I got a PhD in philosophy in 1969 and was a philosophy professor for a while. And so a lot of my thought about suicide comes from my philosophical background. And, of course, I've also been educated in psychiatry. I was trained as a psychiatrist and so on. And so I bring that perspective to it, too. And the perspectives are a little different in the sense that in the medical profession or the psychiatric profession, there is a sort of standard view about suicide, almost a kind of ideology. I mean, an ideology not based on an ideology. It is. I mean, a system of beliefs or ideas, and it's and it is based on studies and so on, and individual doctors' experience. And my take on it is a little different from that standard ideology, and another factor for me is that I have studied near-death experiences. The first living person I ever heard a near-death experience from was in 1965. He was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, Dr. George Ritchie. But even before then, I had studied near-death experiences in the context of ancient Greek philosophy, because a lot of these early Greek philosophers were interested in these near-death experiences. So that's the background I bring to this, and I have, of course, as a psychiatrist, dealt with many patients who were suicidal. I had an uncle who committed suicide, and when I was in high school, which of course is still a painful memory. So those are the backgrounds that I bring to it. And I just think it's a very complicated subject. And the first thing is that it's like that word cancer. We use that word as though that's one thing, but actually there's well over 100 different illnesses that fit under that designation of cancer. So we're dealing with many kind of situations, and that is basically the first thing we encounter when we get into this issue of suicide, because what you see is just a vast array of different kinds of motivations and situations, and to get one which is a very common thing is a situation in which someone decides to make a gesture, have suicidal ideation, and they just decide to make a gesture with the intention of getting attention from their loved ones and so on. But in that situation, maybe they miscalculate. They didn't know that the drugs that they took or whatever were really lethal, and that's something that does happen. So that's one set of motivations, and there are people who make suicide attempts as just sort of a dramatic gesture to get attention, and this is something that every psychiatrist or medical doctor will be familiar with, and a constant thing in the or emergency room. And then another kind of situation is, as you mentioned, a severe depression, people who feel that they're hopeless and they're helpless, there's nothing that can be done, there's no future for them. And then another kind of situation I think that we have are people who have lived a full life and who are, say, elderly, and maybe they've been active all their life, and they are ill, and it's plain that they're not going to get any better. And plenty of people in those situations do take their own lives. And I have a good friend who told me a few years ago that she had a friend who was then in her late 80s and who had a terminal illness, which was portending to bring her pretty quickly into a bedridden state. And this woman had always been a very, very active person who took a great deal of pride in her independence and so on. And she invited my friend, who had been her friend all her life essentially, to lunch, and just had a wonderful time at lunch, and had discussed with my friend actually that she just felt that it was the better thing for her to do to take this graceful exit. So what I'm getting at here is that there is such a vast range of behaviors and motivations. Quite often you see situations where people's judgment is clouded by some sort of physical ailment. And hypothyroidism actually is one in which that's you can read in the medical books that a very common presenting symptom of hypothyroidism is a suicide attempt, because I wouldn't say that people with hypothyroidism are depressed, but it's not really classic depression, but it's an organic situation which it has a lot of results like depression. So anyway, my point here, there's just a vast array, and that's always the first thing you have to think of is, what am I dealing here with? What are the full details of this situation, quite apart from the word suicide? And I should also say, another thing I should bring up here is that I myself made a very serious suicide attempt, and that was how my hypothyroidism was diagnosed. And this was long after I had finished my residency and everything, which goes to show, you can't be your own doctor. And I had one of the funniest things about this, in retrospect, that I specifically remember in medical school, that when I first read about hypothyroidism, it said that people with hypothyroidism are always cold and always sleepy. And I remember thinking, well, gee, they must really have a terrible time because I'm always cold and I'm always sleepy, but, there's nothing wrong with me, right? So denial. But sometime after that, I had a friend, John East, actually. He was a senator from North Carolina. And John was a very conservative politician, and so our friendship was not based on politics. I'm not really interested in politics, but John was a very conservative senator from North Carolina, and I knew him when we were both professors at East Carolina University. We had a very good friendship, and I learned that in Washington, John East had committed suicide, and it was in connection with his hypothyroidism. And interestingly, all of this was stuff that I knew full well, and I never even suspected that I had it myself. And the way it was brought to attention and the diagnosis was made was that I made a suicide attempt. So I have a lot of different backgrounds here to bring to bear on this. And I think that one thing is lacking in the medical side of this is a certain appreciation of the philosophical dimension of it. And it's not in every case, I don't think, are we dealing with a mental illness. I think there are, for example, in the situation of people who, after a full and healthy and independent life, face a terminal illness and just decide that it's better to go out. and that is a moral issue that is debated, I guess, all around the globe. But after a lifetime of reflection at age 70, my opinion is on the side that under those circumstances, it's legitimate for people to take that move. I know that a lot of people go to Switzerland where that is allowed now, for example. So with all that in the background, that's my take on suicide
happening?
Comes from those many factors.
But
now,
Dr. Moody, one thing before, as you open a parenthesis about hypothyroidism, it's quite interesting. Did you mention that it's somewhat related? It's in itself a suicide attempt. Is it because it's an autoimmune related disorder?
Well, it is autoimmune, and that is absolutely a factor in my particular case of hypothyroidism. Yeah, it's called Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and of course, your whole system goes berserk when you have an illness like that, and there are others as well, which are physical ailments, which are often connected with a despondent mood, and that people take their own lives. So we are dealing here with an enormous problem. You ask about why any thoughts I might have about why we're hearing so much about it lately. Well, There are a lot of factors. The suicide rate goes up and down over different over the years, and it's also highly culturally determined. For example, in Japan, for example, I know from friends from Japan who are medical doctors and so on have discussed with me how there is not the stigma in Japan associated with suicide that we have in the United States, and there's a cultural pattern there where it's allowed under certain circumstances or is the expected cultural response, according to some of my friends. So we're dealing here with just an enormous thing. I don't know. Actually, I haven't looked in the last couple of years about what the current rate of suicide in the United States is. But one very interesting fact about the suicide rate, which is particularly interesting to me in that I was a forensic psychiatrist. I worked in a maximum security unit for the criminally insane. And the homicide rate and the suicide rate are connected in very interesting ways. As we all know, these cases of murder-suicide, which are most commonly in the news because of love triangles or something, and an irate husband goes and kills his wife and his wife's current husband or whatever, goes and kills his ex-wife and her new husband and then kills himself. These are kinds of things that we see on a daily basis in the newspapers. And this, too, is culturally variable. For example, in Britain, now I'm using old statistics here. We just have to see what the current ones are. But these are societal trends. In Britain, at a period, the 1/3 of homicides were accompanied by a suicide. In other words, 1/3 of the homicides were homicide-suicides. Now, it's not nearly that high in the United States, so there are these cultural norms. And then another very important aspect of this, which is, I think, and for justifiable reasons, not taken account of by the medical profession, is the spiritual dimension of this. And another area of contact that I've had with the problem of suicide is that over the years I have interviewed many, many, many people who have had their near-death experiences as a result of a suicide attempt. So there's that aspect of it, too. And people who come back from that circumstance, who tell us that they were despondent, they attempted to kill themselves, they almost died, but they were revived. And when they come back, they tell us that they had near-death experiences. And there's something very interesting about this in that the near-death experience of a person who has their experience due to a suicide attempt is no different in quality, as a general rule, than those of people who come close to death for some other reason. But one thing that we do hear definitely from people in that circumstance is that they say that they would never again attempt suicide. And this is borne out in the studies that have been done, which show that in studies in which all the people who attempted suicide over a period of time in a certain hospital and almost died as a result were interviewed, and it was found that some did and some did not have near-death experiences. Now, this is the same as with any other group. In other words, that if it's people who come close to death from any particular cause. Some of them will and others will not have near-death experiences for reasons we just don't know yet. We really don't know the factors why some do and some don't. But in this situation, it was found of the suicidal patients, some of them did and some of them did not have a near-death experience. And the near-death experiences of people who had them as a result of a suicide attempt, as I had said, were no different from near-death experiences of people in other illnesses and so on. But the difference came out in the follow-up, and that was that it was found that the patients who did have a near-death experience in that circumstance subsequently had a zero rate of any further attempts at suicide. And in their discussion of this, in the interviews, they're talking about their suicide attempt vis-a-vis their near-death experience. They said that they learned from their near-death experience that even when times are tough, life does have a purpose. So for that reason, they said they wouldn't do it again. And also many of them mentioned that they realized that had their suicide attempt gone through to completion, then they would have had to have co-lived empathically the impact that their action had on their loved ones left behind, if you see what I mean, that they would have had to directly experience the agony and the sadness and so on that it had come about and their loved ones from their act, and of course that too is no different from any situation of a near-death experience, because whatever the cause of the near-death experience, people will tell us that they see their whole life reviewed and they have to relive from the perspective of those with whom they've interacted the actions of their life. For example, in their life review, they tell us that you see every action you've ever done, and when you see yourself doing an unkind or unloving action to someone, then you are empathically embedded in that person's consciousness so that you feel directly the impact of your action. Or if you see yourself doing a kind-hearted action, then you feel the good feelings you brought about in the life of the person with whom you've interacted. And so these near-death experiences do seem to confer a kind of immunity to further suicide attempts, whereas the patients who did not have a near-death experience in connection with their suicide attempts continue as a group to have a high rate of subsequent attempts to kill themselves. So that indicates that these near-death experiences do confer upon people a kind of immunity to further attempts at this, because one way I would see it is that it gives them a broader philosophical perspective, right, about life. And one thing I think also becomes a big factor in this for many people are religious doctrines about suicide. And of course, I've talked with oddly enough, I never had a patient who committed suicide, and that is just a very unusual thing for a psychiatrist. I think most psychiatrists have had that experience, I gather, from my reading. But of course, that's also taking into account that, my practice has been in a rather different direction. I mean, and we had plenty of suicide attempts in our forensic unit, but just by the luck of the draw, I suppose, I've never had to face that in a patient.
But would you say that probably the reason why you've never had a patient who committed suicide is because they know that you have all these research on near-death experiences that tells us about, the possibility of continuity, So as you said, probably it was like a natural and maybe subliminal preventative for...
well, I'd never thought about that. That might be true in some cases. I think more generally it's just the luck of the draw and the fact that I had been in a situation where it's, a lot of my work was in a forensic hospital, and there was sort of constant monitoring there and so on. So, whereas people in an office practice, for example, where they're not constantly somebody watching over their patients, it's it's a different situation. But I've certainly had friends commit suicide. I had this most wonderful man I met a few years ago. He had been a professor out in California, and he had lost his wife, and just a truly wonderful, wonderful man. And he was just in such agony that he killed himself after the death of his wife. And but I think that layer of judgment that sometimes gets annexed to this, that they're going to hell and so on, that is certainly not consonant with what we hear from people with near-death experiences.
Beautiful.
What we do hear from people with near-death experiences is that there does seem to be some sort of process involved on the other side, according to them, when it's a suicide attempt. But just that, and it has to do with, the learning experience would be that you have to sort of co-participate in the grief of your loved ones, even after you're dead. So, and that makes a certain amount of sense from the learning perspective of it. I think another thing about this, the religious ideation that sometimes gets connected with this is, how should I put this? The idea is that God is sitting up there, and that if somebody kills themselves, that they're going to end up in some terrible hell for eternity. Well, I'm sorry, I just don't buy that.
Yeah,
I think to me, this is the way it is. If you think of suicide, that's one thing, but actually the category that belongs under, in a broader sweep of things, is under the rubric of self-destructive behavior.
Exactly.
Right? And for example, the many people I saw over the years in the ER who, often people with what we call histrionic personalities, who came in and because they had taken a few pills and, in an alleged suicide attempt. Well, that self-destructive behavior, and even though they might not have really, and they would say that they were attempting suicide, but there's more drama to it than depression. And then on the other hand, people who, in a rather hostile mood, on the other extreme, who will say, well, I can't kill you, so I'll kill myself to get back at you, out of that kind of spite. That's an occasional motivator we see with people, too. So my point here is that we're dealing with a vast spectrum of behavior.
Sure, Dr. Moody.
And that spectrum overlaps with what we regard as normal behavior, right? Because, for example, my dear wife is driving down the highway often at 75 miles an hour, looking at her telephone. I am eating too much cholesterol. I have plenty of friends who are drinking themselves to death, and I still have friends who smoke cigarettes. Now, what I want to know is, what's the difference? Imagine God up there in his all all-loving and all-powerful situation, it makes no sense to me to say that God would, he's standing there at the gate and somebody comes in and says, oh, you took 30 minutes with pills, you go to hell. The next person comes is, oh, you took 30 years with cigarettes, you get a pass, you go to heaven. I don't buy it. I think that there is, that is more to do with anxiety. I think that a lot of the religious prohibitions, the strong religious prohibitions on suicide, don't have anything to do with God. What they have to do with is the anxiety of human beings. That it's a good way for religious people, the big religions, to be able to say, well, don't commit suicide because God will put you in hell. Well, that, I think, is just a reflection of human anxiety. It's a way that human beings have of trying to keep people from committing suicide so that they personally won't have to feel guilty, is my opinion. And again, like I said, this is... If there's any psychiatrists listening to this, some of them, if they're very medically oriented, might find these things shocking. But, I'm 70 years old. I've got a certain license to. And as I said, a lot of my thinking about suicide comes as much from my philosophical background as my medical background, because a lot of the great philosophers have had things to say about suicide, and we have both often talked about Plato together, you and I. And,
exactly.
As we both know, Plato had an argument against suicide in his dialogue, the Crito. He said that we're really the property of the gods, he said, and it's not our prerogative to take ourselves out. We've got to wait till the gods say so. And, I think that's overdrawn. But, again, I think that there's a certain amount of truth to it, which I think is this, that whatever we do on this earth, apparently, as the part of the review process we have in the next world, part of that involves taking stock of the consequences of your actions. And my daughter is trying to get in the refrigerator there. And so I think there's that aspect of it, too, that, it's suicide like anything else we do. It can be a learning experience, I think, and apparently in the next life we go through some sort of process of reviewing and learning about ourselves and about reality through the through the reflection on what we have done in this life.
Yeah, we're going to give a short break. When we come back, we have some questions for you, okay?
Good.
We will return to our program after these messages.
New release, Liberation. In this compelling narrative, Andre Louise emphasizes the work of high-order spirits in the effort to convert the spirit Gregorio to the good, an effort that culminates with the unforgettable re-encounter with his mother, herself a highly evolved spirit, wherein he surrenders to the irresistible call of love. The book also contains information on how unhappy spirits act as they try to involve incarnates in their wiles. The spirit author tells of the intercession of high-order spirits on behalf of human beings, demonstrating the divine compassion that grants to all the blessed opportunity to free themselves by means of study, labor, and persevering service in the practice of the good. Buy your copy today at www.ediceiofamerica.com.
Spread the word. Kardec Radio, to learn more about Spiritism.
Want spirituous books for your children? At Eddie Save America, you will find a collection of them. From the best-selling book, Our Father, in which the Spirit May May through Chico Xavier brought countless poems, stories, and folk tales based on the Lord's Prayer, to the beautiful and educational collection by the author Adelson Sales on Back to School and many others. Buy your copy today at www.eddiesaveamerica.com.
Nourish Your Soul with Kardec Radio.
If you missed out on previous shows, no worries. We have an on-demand sections of all previous shows and interviews. Go to our website, www.kardecradio.com.
Nourish Your Soul with Kardec Radio.
Spiritism for Everyone is the live web study meeting and educational program of the United States Spiritist Council. This year, in commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the Gospel according to Spiritism, the Spiritism for Everyone program will present an in-depth study of this remarkable book. Join us every Wednesday evening through the web from any computer or mobile device, no matter where you are in the U.S. Spiritism for Everyone is free, open to all, and requires no registration. For more information, go to www.spiritist.us.
And now we return to our program.
Listener, we are back, and we are back to talk about suicide. We are here with Dr. Raymond Moody Jr. Before the break, we had the listener named Chris was here with us at Kardec Radio and was sharing some thoughts at Blog Talk Radio, talking about his opinion regarding what's happening in the world. Chris thinks that there's a lot of darkness, negativity, that the media is also putting a lot of focus on negative and sensational things, and also talks about the fact that many people are devoid of meaning in their lives. Well, we also would like to share that if you go to the website of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, we have the latest facts and figures based on the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, Data and Statistics Fatal Injury Report for 2011. There they talk about the fact that someone in the country dies by suicide every 13 minutes. It's alarming, very alarming, and it gives more on the demographics of it, talking about the age range. The high suicide rate goes to people between 45 and 64 years old, and it talks about suicide rates being higher, 4 times higher among men than among women. And it talks about ethnicity being the highest for white people, etc. So there are many things talking about the methods of suicide, etc., etc. We're just sharing this with you, not that we want to become experts in the field of suicide just because, but it's good to know that there are things for each and every one of us to do, either to help ourselves or to help other people. Actually, last year, in May of 2013, the New York Times published an article talking about suicide rates rising sharply in the United States, especially among middle-aged Americans, and they correlated that to the economic crisis. Well, there's a lot to talk about, and Dr. Moody Jr. is here with us, sharing his thoughts, his experience, and his philosophy behind it. Dr. Moody Jr., you also talked about the fact that there are many lives, reincarnation. Let me share with you. There is a thought. We in Spiritism, according to Allan Kardec and other authors like Dr. Andre Lewis, we agree with you in regards to what happens to suicides in the afterlife. If people read the book Heaven and Hell, Kardec reports the the accounts of many spirits who committed suicide, and they don't say they're burning in hell. They say other things, and it's interesting for people to get a hold of it, that actually life doesn't end there, or we don't go to hell just because we committed suicide. We're not telling people, hey, go ahead and commit suicide because nothing's going to happen to you. We're just saying that other things may happen, and it's good to know what's the accounts of the spirits. But, Dr. Moody, we know that there is the law of cause and effect, and we know that for everything we do, like smoking a cigarette, drinking to death, etc., can also be a form of suicide. We call in spiritism indirect suicide.
Yes,
so
yes.
It's lesioned probably the spiritual body, and in a next lifetime, we're going to reap the consequences. Do you have any thought in that regard?
Well, it's occurred to me a long time ago that the very best learning situation is to see the effects of what you've done. So, and I don't think that in any way as punishment or correction or anything. I think of that as learning. Apparently, when we die, there's a kind of mirror effect where the way I like to say it is that one thing we can know for sure about these near-death experiences is that for many people anyway, that life is a two-phase process. Apparently, we live life forward as the actor or protagonist, and then at the end of it, we review identically the same action from the perspective of the other characters who are involved in our life. And I just think that's an ideal way of learning. I mean, what better system could you have? So, that wouldn't surprise me to find that, yes, that you have some experience, a counterbalancing nature, which is, I think, necessarily, it's always going to be asymmetrical and open-ended unless you can see the whole picture, right? Not just from your perspective, but also from the perspective of the others with whom you've interacted. So, to me, that just seems like a very great way to put things together.
And
like I said, I don't really think of it in a like as a justice system exactly. I wouldn't think of it as justice. I think of it more as learning. Apparently the way this thing is set up is that you get to see whatever you do from the perspective of the other people involved, and there's some sort of learning that goes along with that process. And these issues are really coming out now in a very real way. I think there are a lot of factors. One is the aging of the baby boomers, who are a very influential part of our population, are just naturally reaching that point of life where they begin to reflect on these big issues. So the question of an afterlife is coming into many people's minds about now as just part of a developmental process. And you might be interested to know, by the way, that in the United States, the journal called Missouri Medicine, it's a medical journal, and the way the medical journals in the United States are rated is that the New England Journal of Medicine is number 1, and then the Missouri Medicine is actually rated on that scale, number 5, which is very impressive. So it's a very respected medical journal. And the Missouri Medicine is currently in the midst of an 18-month series in their journal on articles about near-death experiences from physicians who have studied them or from physicians who have actually had them. And this is a remarkable series of articles. The current issue has an article by a man, a professor of orthopedic surgery in New York, who was struck by lightning and who had a very dramatic near-death experience, and who says, and this clearly in his article, he says, well, there's life after death. I've been there. And the issue before that, there was an equally impressive article by a woman. I forget her specialty. It might have been, I don't know, perhaps dermatology, but whatever. She talked about her near-death experience. So this seems to be opening up just a little bit in the medical community through that sort of thing, for the reason, I think, that whatever the explanation of these things is, they are a factor in clinical medicine, because we know that quite a number of our patients who are revived after cardiac arrest or some other life-threatening illness or injury often have these near-death experiences. So it becomes a matter of clinical interest as well.
Dr. Moody Jr., I have two major questions I cannot forget to ask you about your take, if you have any evidence or anything that you observed in your practice regarding this. Dr. Andrea Lewis once wrote a book named Evolution into Worlds, and he talks about the discarnation of children and the death of children, and talks about the fact that a possible explanation to this is the fact that in a previous life they were suicidals, and now they are, and it's not a punishment, it's just like cause and effect. And by the fact that action lesioned their spiritual body, when they reincarnate next, they live somewhat shortly because they're still readjusting their spiritual body in that attempted reincarnation. And he discussed actually the different types of suicides and the methods that were used and what can possibly happen in a next lifetime, medically speaking. What do you think about this?
Well, first of all, I don't have any basis to say either way.
Okay.
But I can speak philosophically on that by saying that I am beginning to sort of figure out that this thing that we're in called life is set up in a very, very wonderful way to take account of all these things. I just don't know about that specific point, but I as you know, for a long time I sort of resisted this idea of an afterlife because I was not raised religious, and to me it's just still a very counterintuitive idea. But what I see now are cases where the bystanders as well as the person with a near-death experience can comment on the situation, and that, for example, just to give one example, I know of a case of an artist who had a very profound near-death experience, and when he was in a horrific car crash, and in which his wife was killed. And when he decided to bring this up to his trauma surgeon who had saved his life, the trauma surgeon became very solemn and said, well, I've never told anybody this, but that night you came into the hospital, I talked with your wife while you were in surgery, so that his wife, who had been killed in the accident, and I know of other cases of this as well, where not only the patient with a near-death experience, but medical personnel who are involved in the case experience things. So at a certain point, it just becomes, to me, I realized a couple of years ago that it sounds, you have to make so many assumptions to think your way out of the idea that there's an afterlife, that to my utter astonishment, it's become to me just, I think what I would say my assessment is, let's put it this way, that we do live after we die.
Dr. Moody, based on this, I need to go another level here, and we can talk philosophically if there is no foundation for it in your practice or research, but there is another thought. Another author named Emmanuel actually wrote in one of his books that whenever we think, we are connecting to mental currents that are invisible to us, and thus we may be influenced by such. And it's very much aligned with the book Thoughts Are Things by Prentice Mulford. And what do you think about that? People who actually commit suicide induced by entities, which we call in Spiritism obsession, which is this negative influence. Have you heard about people who attempt suicide and they heard voices pushing them towards that direction? What do you think about this?
Well, yes, that is actually a fairly common thing, that people hear voices, and that's right, trying to get them to commit suicide and so on. And the explanation that's generally given for that is schizophrenia, for example. Now, again, I can't address whether there is some bigger thing, the entities you addressed or anything. I just don't know. It's a very easy thing for me to say I don't know, if you know what I mean. Long ago when I was a kid, I realized as about 7 years of age that I would never know much of anything, and so I'm content with that. But I will say this, that in my psychiatric career, there were 2 specific cases I had which did not seem to be any sort of mental illness that's in the book, or it didn't even seem to be a mental illness. And yet both of these cases were conformed to the classic definition of possession. And one of them was a man who was an internationally renowned scientist who was the research director of a major technical institute and university. And he had a succubus, and which is a situation in which from his perspective, he was being assaulted by a female spirit. And the interesting thing about this is that he was going to work every day, and the institution that he worked for treasured him, but I went into this thinking that it was a psychological thing. And I cannot lie. And even though this is a rather embarrassing thing to report, I experienced something during my therapeutic encounter with him, which, for want of a better term, I saw the entity leave his body. And I know, to someone who wasn't there, that I'm sure sounds extraordinary, and maybe that I'm psychotic or something, and they are perfectly within their rights to think that. But I trust my judgment, and I saw something I just don't understand. It was almost like seeing into some other alternate geometry. There's no other way I can describe it. And then when I was a resident, we had a case of a demonic little kid who was, I think, about 6 or 7, and he was in a place that, he was just totally had to be confined for his own good and that of others. And they sent him to us for some sort of help. And so my attendings and I tried to work with him, and we had sadly to send back the report to the institution that we just, there was nothing we could do. We had nothing to offer. And he had the typical things you think. His voice would become very deep, and it was as though he was possessed, for want of a better term. But, that's out of thousands and thousands of cases, I guess, of people I've been involved with. But those two cases, to this day, ring to me that was something going on which is not in the medical books.
Dr. Moody, we have here Abby Scher from Baltimore, Maryland, who actually shares with us that she's a volunteer at NAMI, the National Association for Mental Health. She says that as she volunteers in the psychiatric awards at the University of Maryland, it's usually packed, including the geriatric, which is over 50. Most people are severely depressed, no hope, they became suicidal. It's very hard. And we have here a friend, Lizzie Costi, from the Spirit Side of Virginia in Chantilly. She actually asks a question to you. What about people who tend to, attempt suicide more than once? What is on the behind the scenes? Is there something different from those who actually attempt once and that's it?
Well, there are a lot of multiple attempters too. And yes. And sometimes I think, again, here we have lots of different situations. But one thing that goes along in that with people with these cyclic depressions, or what we used to call manic depression, or now the bipolar disorder, and that during the depressive swings, they can, it makes sense that they have more than one attempt. Yes, so that is not at all unusual, that a person who has made one attempt will subsequently make another. That is absolutely right. That occurs very often. I can think of many patients that we saw recurrently in the emergency room over a period of time, with these repeated suicide attempts. And again, we're dealing here with just life situations that are very hard for people to deal with. I mean, we've made quite a lot of strides in psychiatry, but there's two kinds of people. There are many kinds of people. One kind of person just doesn't want to allow that there's anything that they don't know. And then there are other people, and I would include myself in this group, that are much more open to just saying, I don't know. And not that I haven't read the opinions and the literature and so on, but that's been all my life. I've been content to say that I don't know when I don't know. And all my life have had this feeling that, I'll never know very much in my life, but that at the same time I just do enjoy. One of the highlights of my life has been attempting to learn, and I learn new stuff all the time, but keep in mind also in the back of my mind that really it's always okay to say I don't know. I think a lot of people are terrified to say I don't know, especially if they're supposed to be an expert. And so that's, I think, a personality difference among people.
That's interesting. It makes sense to us, Dr. Moody. Dr. Moody, it's always a blessing and honor to have you here with us and to learn from you.
Likewise, I'm always so happy to be with you.
It's wonderful, and we really appreciate what you're doing, keeping these videos available at your website. We want to tell the listener, go to the website Life After Life, and there you're going to find the links to wonderful, very up-to-date insights and teachings from Dr. Moody Jr. on suicide, mental health, and much, much more. Dr. Moody Jr., what would you like to share as your final comments just for today at Kardec Radio, for those who are listening to us, and, usually people who click on this very program to listen about suicide, either they've heard about somebody who committed suicide and they're close to them, or they even attempted. What would you like to tell them?
Yes. Well, what I would like to say, and this is perhaps the most, the best advice or words that someone can say to people who are concerned about the potential of suicide in a family member or a friend. And that is that suicide ideation is always to be taken seriously. That is, that if somebody threatens suicide or talks about suicide, even if you feel that it's just bluff or drama, that it's always really the best thing to try to get that person into some sort of treatment, because very often people say that as soon as they made the attempt that they wish they hadn't. So I think that's the most important thing, to know that the talking about it or ideation about it is a very serious thing, and to try to get people help.
Great. That's wonderful. And it's never too soon. Actually, it could be late. So trying to help out is something, and to reach out to those is something of urgency. And thank you so much, Dr. Moody, for everything you do, for being with us at Kardec Radio again today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's always good to be with you.
Dear listener, we know the topic is very, very touching, and it's deep and sensitive. I know you want to hear more about it, and you can contact us at kardecradio.com. We have a contact form, and you can ask us your questions. If by any chance you have questions to Dr. Moody, you can go to his website, lifeafterlife.com, and get to know more about what he does, answers, and send him an email as well. When we talk about suicide and spiritism, as Dr. Moody said, it's about something in us that needs to be revisited, personality-wise. And we're talking about the millennial spirit that has been living for many existences. And usually when somebody commits suicide in one life, they have to come again in another incarnation to go through the same test and not give up. This means we need help. We need especially spiritual awareness. And as Dr. Moody Jr. said, there's so many factors playing a role in suicide and attempt of suicide, that if you or somebody whom you know talk about, I'm thinking of, this life is not worth living, watch out. Because that's a sign that something is off. Don't disregard it, thinking, no, but I won't do anything. Well, if things become critical, maybe you will, or maybe that person will. Don't wait for that moment. Go for help. You can go to spiritist centers, to medical doctors, to psychologists, but I will say, pray before you find help. Pray always. Prayer, as Kardec shows in the book Heaven and Hell, is always 100%, always the best means to protect you from actually engaging into that. Pray always. And suggestion is, learn to pray before you go, you have problems in your life, because then it becomes automatic. You can go into the prayerful mode when you're suffering the most. But remember, don't give up, because life does not end there. Your problems are only going to increase when we engage into suicide attempt. And if it actually happens, it's going to be worse. Not because we're going to burn in hell, and Dr. Moody is right. We're not. But the hell of our conscience, the guilt, is actually something we're going to carry, not only in one life, but lives to come. Plus, as you can listen to a CD of a talk given by Dr. Raul Teixeira years ago at the Spirit Society of Baltimore, and it's a CD on mental health. You can buy it at the bookstore of the Spirit Society of Baltimore, www.ssbaltimore.org. There you're going to find in that very talk a question and answer moment in which Dr. Raul Teixeira explained, according to the Spiritist teachings, that for each suicide, it takes at least 200 years for the suicidal person to make amends with their own conscience and with everyone who was hit by that action. So we're talking about a decision that we make in seconds, impacting more than 200 years from now. I don't think we don't want to go there. So let us help one another. You know, prayer is always the best way to go. How about if we pray now? Let us pray for those who committed suicide recently. Let us pray for ourselves if we are thinking in that direction. And let us pray that more and more resources come to life to help prevent and also remedy those issues here and in the afterlife. Dear listener, let us pray. Dear Mother, Father God, we need these maternal hands of Mother Mary and her wonderful team of rescuers, whom we know are designed by your love to rescue suicidal spirits all over the earth. May all those whom we know who committed suicide feel their loving hands caressing and relieving them from the pain and the anguishes of the consequences of their action of self-destruction. But as Dr. Moody Jr. mentioned, aren't we also in the movement of self-destruction when we overeat, when we are distracted while driving, or when we are drinking alcohol, or smoking, or going through insane actions? Please help us to align ourselves and become more balanced. And especially, may we be able to serve more and more those who are around us and in our lives. May these flowers of your healing light reach out to all those who are suffering from suicide, from family members to the very individuals, brothers and sisters of ours. And so be it. Dear listener, we hope you have enjoyed and share with other friends the fact that these programs at Kardec Radio are here on demand for you. You can listen to them on iTunes at any computer and smartphone, iTunes, Tuning Radio, blogtalkradio.com, kardekradio.com. You can listen to any one of them here live. And you know what's going to happen in a week from today? On October 11th, Saturday at 11 a.m., we're going to have a live interview with another magnificent researcher and physician in the United States. Dr. Larry Dossey is going to be here again at Kardec Radio, and this time the best-selling author of Reinventing Medicine is going to talk about something that is quite important, the Manifesto for a Post-Materialistic Science. Oh, there is a lot to share with you, a lot, because science is really making efforts to deal with these issues in the best possible way, trying to treat us as the whole human being. And you can join us live, asking your questions, or sending us an email to Kardec Radio. Now, dear listener, tomorrow at 8 p.m. we have Spiritist Awareness with several hosts from around the world telling you more and more about the Spiritist message. And on Wednesday, Franziska Kranz from Germany and Mackenzie Mello from the United States joined forces to read another chapter from the book No Solar by Andrea Lewis, with permission from Edisei of America. And not only that, they make comments, and you can ask them questions as well. On Thursday, Daniel Santos from Spiritist Awareness is going to stream another beautiful talk, Spiritist Talk, from speakers around the world. Dear listener, we hope this message came across clear and also inspirational. If not, write to us at KardecRadio.com. We have a contact form. We are always happy to hear from you. In the meantime, dear listener, let us keep feeling the blessings of God always.
Thank you for listening to Kardec Radio, broadcasting live every Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Email us and share your comments at www.kardecradio.com. Until next time, we wish you many blessings.